However, the real standout quality of Volume 2 was its tendency to go balls out on pretty much every crazy idea it could possibly cram in. This is what I imagine RWBY was originally destined to be for most of its run. A total free flow of as many interesting ideas and concepts as they could possibly work into the series that constantly builds on itself through world building, characterization, character relationships, and thematic intrigue. Back when I made my RWBY video for Anime News Network, I made the horrendous mistake of checking Reddit to see what people were saying outside the comments section. There I stumbled upon quite possibly the most extreme misinterpretation of my views I've ever seen, where someone compared my relationship with RWBY to that of someone obsessing over an ex-girlfriend, even though the ANN video was the first time I'd written an analysis about RWBY in over 3 years. Despite this, while I'm obviously not a RWBY grifter in any sense, I do have to admit that there is something about this franchise that makes me a bit obsessive towards it. Because, yes, in certain ways, it is a franchise that I keep coming back to in my mind, wondering why it all went wrong. And it took the full runtime of RWBY Ice Queendom to reaffirm something that I already knew. Something that you also knew that I already knew because I literally just played it for you about 45 seconds ago. The thing that I love most about RWBY, the thing that I've always loved most about RWBY, is its ability to throw out as many ideas as possible and combine them into one of the strangest and tastiest melting pots of animated insanity I've ever seen. A trait that its Japanese counterpart seems to have fully embraced as well, though not without just as many bizarre drawbacks. Admittedly, the early episodes of Ice Queendom don't do a whole lot to make this show very enticing, with the first 3 in particular making it glaringly obvious that prior knowledge is needed to fully understand this world, and even more so, these characters. The opening episodes are basically a speed run of Volume 1 plus a brief introduction of anime exclusive elements in order to set up the larger plot arc that follows, and it makes it very unkind towards characterization. I cannot recommend this series if you haven't seen RWBY already, and I'm still not sure if that was the intention or not. That said, there are a few changes in these opening episodes that I thought were genuinely good, such as introducing Tai from the very beginning. Seeing that RWBY and Yang grew up with a supportive and loving father is important because, along with Tai, we also get an early introduction to Jacques, who is completely unsupportive and controlling of Weiss's actions and desires. Because this new storyline focuses so heavily on Weiss and how she could fall down a darker path under the right circumstances, it's important to understand the context for how she got to be this way. So immediately contrasting her family with RWBY's adds more fuel to their rivalry throughout this series. Even on the action front, there are some small changes that feel right at home in a RWBY anime. In that long-ass RWBY video I cited earlier, I put a lot of emphasis on the choreography surrounding Team Juniper's fight with the Deathstalker and how exciting and creative it was. Rather than attempt to recreate that moment beat for beat, Ice Queendom comes up with its own exciting choreography, where Pyrrha spikes her javelin into the Deathstalker's head, which Nora then uses as a nail to push it all the way through. An incredibly cool and brutal kill, which made me somewhat confident that this series had the ambition to do more than the bare minimum or just copy the source material. Once we get out of the recap, Ice Queendom truly starts to fly off the handle in the best and worst ways. Setting the bulk of this series inside of a dream world was easily the best decision they could have made for the story, as it allows for a wide array of bizarre imagery and outlandish ideas. A depressing company town to represent the hyper-capitalist greed of the Schnee Dust Company, a statue of her grandfather that eventually turns into a giant robot they have to fight, a bunch of mini Weisses to represent the different childish behaviors she's repressed in order to be accepted by her father, a train that builds the tracks in front of it as it goes and stretches over the city skyline, the entire Blake transformation sequence. Even the different strategies that RWBY's team makes use of during their deployment into Weiss's dream, like the fact that Jean has developed an immunity to the Nightmare Grim just like you would a common virus, or the myriad of doorways and other items that Xion's abilities afford them within the dream world, are just some of the really fun and inventive ideas that often boil down to me shouting, "That's so fucking cool," at my TV screen. And the frequency with which I get to shout that is just as high as it was in those early volumes of RWBY I loved so much. It is unfortunate though that there are more moments than I would like where the cool ideas come at the expense of proper pacing. If there's one thing I can't accuse Ice Queendom of, it's dragging its feet, and that's not always a positive. To be clear, the sheer concentration of these cool ideas doesn't mean they were thrown in without purpose aside from the cool factor. Most of the standout imagery in Weiss's dream feeds back into either the dispassionate control her family exerts on her, or her subconscious desire to block out the world and keep her heart free of any ideas that would challenge her worldview too much. The constant surveillance by the statues of her father, as well as the repeated messages directly to her, convey the sheer amount of pressure she's under to be worthy of the Schnee name according to her father's expectations. This relates back to the beings known as sillies, which are essentially anyone whom Weiss views as acting improper, with the line about how sillies lose the right to be a Schnee, implying that deviation from expectations could lead to outright disinheritance. The fortress she's built for herself in this dream world is very obviously meant to keep all the parts of her she sees as unsightly locked away inside her heart. And the decision to let RWBY and her friends in as the train approaches represents the first step towards Weiss opening her heart to them in her dream. The fact that anything Faunus related has been isolated to a dilapidated manor on the far edges of her dreamscape shows how the existence of the Faunus and her relationship to them is one so complicated that she simply does not want to deal with it, and so she casts it as far from her mind as possible. Again, it is incredibly unsubtle, but it's so grandiose and explosive in its lack of subtlety that it's still immensely entertaining, while also being able to tap into a lot of universal experiences. The struggle between keeping your emotions locked away versus letting others in so they can share in your troubles, blocking out the world and staying locked inside where everything is safe and standardized, versus venturing out into a wild and diverse society where you don't know what you'll run into. That's always a bit unnerving on some level, and Ice Queendom taps into that sentiment rather well, with the accompanying symbolism being so overt and familiar that, to some degree, it kind of makes up for the notable lapse in characterization. That lack of subtlety even got me to realize something about the main RWBY series that I had never noticed before. In Volume 4, we're introduced to Klein, Weiss's butler, who appears to have multiple personality disorder. In Ice Queendom, Klein is split up into 7 different entities in Weiss's dream, each with a different personality and corresponding adjectives such as grumpy or sleepy. It was upon meeting Dopey Klein that I realized that he was a reference to the 7 dwarves from Snow White, which seems incredibly obvious in hindsight since Weiss herself was already an obvious parallel to Snow White with her mirror motif. Regardless of how obvious it was in the original series, this reinterpretation of Klein enhanced his role in the series several-fold and was presented in such a goofy yet entertaining way that I fell in love with the concept immediately. Of course, all of these cool ideas would be for naught if their presentation ended up being lackluster, and on that end, well, it's complicated. On the whole, Ice Queendom does have some sense of directorial style when it comes to the visuals. That might seem like a backhanded compliment, and to a degree it kind of is, but considering how many anime just don't have any style whatsoever, it's a lot more of a positive than you might think. And on the whole, I like the angle that Ice Queendom is going for. A lot of its more striking elements are those that zero in on a sense of unease through the use of harsher lighting, more saturated colors, and unnerving camera work. The moments where it wants you to be uncomfortable, whether it's Weiss confronting her negative self for the first time, or the clapping scene in RWBY's dream sequence, display a strong control over the tone they're trying to convey. The color design in particular is definitely one of its standout cinematic qualities. While the recap episodes feature mostly bland, borderline mediocre uses of color, the dream world sequences are positively bursting with extravagant and enrapturing displays that ramp up the intensity of these moments far beyond what a more standard palette could convey, with Blake's transformation in episode 10 being the strongest example of this. Everything about this sequence is just so goddamn cool and exploding with visual creativity down to the smallest details. Even in the moments where it overreaches and doesn't quite have a complete handle on the finer details of whatever cinematic technique is being used, the broader expression remains clear and, much like the symbolism in the narrative, extremely conspicuous. One of the most prominent techniques it employs is that of split screens, and hoo boy does this show love its split screens. This one's definitely up there in terms of the frequency and directness with which it uses this technique, and on the whole, most of them are solidly implemented. When done right, it can easily feed into that sense of unease I mentioned earlier, especially the more dynamic shots where the aspect ratio of each panel changes over the course of a single cut to convey the scene's power dynamics. Admittedly, there are moments where it feels like they get carried away and use it just for the sake of not having a more standard shot, but at least that means they're trying to think outside the box on how to visually portray this series. It's in the action, however, that we find the most standout moments. Just about every action cut in this series swings for the fences, and the moments where it hits are some of the flashiest bits of action hype I've seen all year. Though admittedly, some of them do border on being unreadable because so much is happening. I also want to give special attention to cuts done by Hiroto Nagata, whose intense, high-speed sequences provide the absolute peaks of Ice Queendom, much in the same way that Monty Ohm's fight sequences in early RWBY were so incredibly hype. Like this cut of Yang riding up the side of the Nicholas robot before jumping off her bike and basically exploding into a massive punch as her character model deforms with such spectacular style feels exactly like something I would see from an early RWBY fight scene. Even outside the general flashiness of it all, there are so many interesting details about certain cuts that just stand out as being super cool and fun. Whether it's the intricacies of how different characters wield their weapons, or the simple fact that they decided to give RWBY a snowboard to move around in Weiss's dream world and show off some fun little snowboarding sequences. All that said, there is no denying that a lot of this show is just straight up ass. Wonky character models with fundamentally bad designs, a desperate need for corrections, and a general confusion over what makes for good color design leaves a lot to be desired in some of the less intense scenes. Episode 9 even has what I can only describe as a layering error, where parts of Yang's legs are just cut off before the camera can pan past those points, something I had never even seen before in an anime. Like, come on guys, that's not even the part of Yang you're supposed to cut off. I understand that it's just not possible for it to have peak animation every single second, but the pendulum swing between great and terrible is so wide that it's almost laughable, especially when two cuts of wildly different quality end up right next to each other. It's tempting to say that the good moments outweigh the bad, but I'm not even sure if that's true, and that's a damn shame considering how many good moments there are. Even after all of that, I'm still left wondering if this anime really got RWBY. I've already mentioned it in passing a couple times, but the pacing of the early episodes really kills a lot of the characterization necessary for the emotional beats that come later on. It doesn't really feel like Team RWBY are actually friends before they dive into Weiss's dream, because we rarely get to see them interact outside of combat. and when we do, it's mostly bickering and condescension. This lack of proper relationship building gets compounded by the fact that they really lean into Weiss being racist towards the Faunus. And by the end, it doesn't feel like she went through a proper character arc, and they just kinda gloss over that part of her character. Again, to quote one of my previous RWBY videos, this isn't character development, it's character absolution. And combined with the both sidesing of the Faunus racism issue, it paints an extremely questionable view of this show's morality. Yet, at the same time, there is so much about Ice Queendom that feels distinctly RWBY. The non-stop barrage of fascinating world building combined with generally cool and outlandish concepts do blend together in a way that, while certainly bumpy in a lot of areas, remains intriguing and exciting nonetheless. It has a deliberate and distinct directorial style that gives the series a unique identity overflowing with personality, yet never feels like it's trying to distance itself from what people like about the original. It even replicates RWBY's implementation of insert songs, with episode 7's use of the song Any Moment probably being the most thematically interesting. Ice Queendom does understand a lot of what makes RWBY good, but not all of it. And that's the part that drags this series down so much. And yet, even through the bad characterization and rushed plot points and broken animation, I can't bring myself to hate or even fully dislike Ice Queendom, because it gave me something that I've been waiting to resurface in RWBY proper for years, that deliciously unhinged melting pot of fantastical ideas. It's wild, untamed, and so in love with whatever new concept it's throwing at you that I can't help but feel fondly towards it. This imperfect creativity left more of a mark on me during this summer anime season than a lot of the shows that I actually gave positive scores to. And I honestly wouldn't mind coming back to it again in the future, along with those early volumes of RWBY that I still love. Special thanks to Rourke Tenjoin, Qreativity, Ryan Johnson, and all my other patrons for their generous support. My name is Ember, and I'll see you next time.